Have you ever felt God growing distant? Not because you stopped praying, not because you walked away, but precisely during a season when you were trying harder than ever and found yourself unable to explain why. If there is one area of your life, one relationship, one future you have quietly kept off the altar, something you give God everything except, do you believe that holding that one thing might be changing the quality of what you feel in prayer? And what would your spiritual life look like? What would your interior life feel like if the only thing standing between you and the closeness with God you most desire turned out to be something you have the power to give Him today? There is a particular kind of spiritual suffering that does not come from sin, does not come from doubt, and does not come from distance. It comes from nearness that has stopped just short of complete. It is the suffering of a soul that has given much, but not everything. That has opened most of the doors, but kept one sealed. That loves God genuinely and deeply, and still, in a way it may not be able to name, holds something back. Catherine of Siena, mystic, doctor of the church, a woman who spoke to popes and walked into plague wards and dictated theological letters she could not write herself, understood this suffering from the inside. She understood why Jesus allows a soul to feel His absence when what the soul is actually experiencing is the consequence of its own held-back portion. And she understood, because she had lived it, what happens on the other side of full surrender. Subscribe, because if you have been feeling the distance, and you are not sure why, and you have not stopped trying, you need to hear what Catherine learned about the one thing God is still waiting for. There is a category of spiritual experience that the great mystics write about with unusual candor, and that most ordinary believers have experienced but rarely been given language for. It is not the dark night of the soul in the classic sense, that profound and stripping absence of consolation that John of the Cross described, and that God sometimes sends to advanced souls as a form of purification. It is something different, closer, more ordinary, and in some ways more unsettling precisely because it is so ordinary. It is the feeling of God at a slight remove, not gone, not absent in the catastrophic sense, simply not quite as close as He once was, or not quite as close as you sense He could be. The prayer that used to feel warm now feels competent. The scripture that once seemed to leap off the page now reads as familiar and undisturbing. The sense of being known, of being held, of being accompanied, still there, perhaps, but muted, as if a layer of glass has been placed at some imperceptible moment between you and the fire. And the bewildering thing is that this often happens not to souls that have gone cold, but to souls that are trying, that are showing up, that are doing the things they know to do, and doing them faithfully, and still finding, in the quiet of honest prayer, that something is not quite right. Catherine of Siena was born in 1347, the 24th of 25 children, in a city that would soon be devastated by the Black Death. She was a girl who prayed in stairwells and made small vows by the time she was 7. By the time she was a young woman, she had chosen a life of radical solitude in a small room in her family's home. 3 years of near-complete silence, interior prayer, and what her biographer called a sustained conversation with God that shaped everything she would later become. She was not by any measure a careless soul. She was one of the most intentional people in the history of Christian spirituality. Every hour mattered to her. Every interior movement was attended to, examined, brought before God. She gave more than most people can imagine giving, and yet even Catherine, even this woman, knew seasons of spiritual distance that she could not initially explain by any failure or negligence on her part. She was not sinning more. She was not praying less. She was not, by any external measure, doing anything differently. And still, something was not quite meeting. What she came to understand, and what the Church has received through her as a genuine spiritual insight, is that God's longing for a soul is total. He does not want the large portion with the small portion held back. He does not receive partial surrender the way a parent receives a gift from a child, gratefully for what it is, without asking for more. He receives partial surrender the way a lover receives a partial confession of love. With gratitude, yes, and with continued faithfulness, yes, but with a particular and patient awareness that something has not yet been said. And what happens in prayer when God is aware of the thing that has not yet been said is precisely what many souls experience without understanding, a quality of nearness that remains just short of full intimacy. Not because God withdraws, not because he is punishing the soul for what it has not yet given, but because full intimacy, the kind of closeness that Catherine would later call the cell of self-knowledge filled with the presence of God, requires the whole heart. And a heart with a sealed room is not quite the whole heart. This is the distance nobody talks about because it is so easy to misread. The soul experiencing it assumes it is a spiritual problem to be solved by more prayer, more penance, more effort. But the distance is not a problem of effort. It is a problem of surrender. And no amount of added effort will close the gap that only surrender can close. Catherine learned this, and she was not ashamed to teach it, quietly, pastorally, in the letters she dictated to anyone who would carry her words. To souls in crisis and souls in consolation and souls in exactly the state of muted nearness we are describing. You are close. You have given much, but there is still something held back. And he is waiting, not in judgment, in love, with the specific and patient quality of love that knows what the beloved is capable of giving and refuses to accept less, not because it wants to punish, but because it knows that less is not enough, not for the love it has in mind, not for the closeness it is trying to create. You know what is in the sealed room. If you have been honest with yourself for even a moment in prayer, you know. It may not be dramatic. It is rarely a secret sin. More often, it is a dream, a plan, a relationship, a version of the future, a fear so deep and so private that you have never named it aloud, even to God. And he is waiting, just there, just outside the door you have not yet opened. Before we can understand what Catherine means when she speaks of surrender, we have to clear away what she does not mean. Because the word has been used in so many damaging ways, in theology, in culture, in the very specific damage that religious formation sometimes does to a person, that for many souls, the word itself is an obstacle. They hear surrender, and they hear loss. They hear passivity. They hear the particular cruelty of a spirituality that uses divine will as a reason to stop wanting anything, to dismiss the self entirely. to become a kind of non-person in the name of holiness. This is not Catherine's surrender. This was never Catherine's surrender. Catherine was not passive. She was one of the most assertive, most vividly alive human beings who has ever lived. She wrote letters to Gregory XI that told the Pope directly that he was failing in his responsibility and needed to return to Rome. She walked into hospitals during the plague and washed the bodies of the dying with her own hands, without protective distance, without the performance of detachment. She argued, she insisted, she wept. She burned with love in ways that her contemporaries found almost disorienting in their intensity. This is what surrender produced in Catherine. Not stillness of the passive kind, stillness of the free kind, the stillness of a person who no longer spent any energy managing the gap between what she wanted and what God wanted, because there was no longer a gap. Her desires and his desires had become, through years of interior work and through the specific gift of surrender, the same desires. And that freed her to move through the world with the full force of who she was, completely, without the drag of interior division. What she surrendered was not her personality, not her intelligence, not her convictions, not her capacity to love fiercely or argue forcefully or grieve genuinely. She surrendered her claim on outcomes. She surrendered the insistence that her life take the shape she had imagined. She surrendered the private veto, the part of the heart that says, "I will give God everything, but not this, not yet, not this specific thing that I am not ready to release." That is the surrender, not the dissolution of the self, but the release of the self's grip on the things it has decided it cannot live without. And this distinction matters enormously for the soul that is afraid to surrender. Because the fear, and it is real and it deserves to be named, the fear is usually not about God in the abstract. It is about something specific, a specific thing that God might ask for, a specific change, loss, or redirection that the soul has quietly determined it could not survive. Catherine received one of the most direct teachings on this fear in the mystical conversations she had with Christ, documented and transmitted through her dictation to her disciples. He told her something that she found simple and radical in equal measure. He said that the soul that fears surrender has, in effect, decided that its own understanding of what it needs is more reliable than his. That the locked room is an act, however unconscious, however well-intentioned, of not quite believing that he is trustworthy with what is inside it. And this is the heart of it. This is what the distance in prayer is communicating. Not, "You are bad," not, "You have failed," but, "There is a place in you that does not yet trust me. And I am here, and I am patient, and I am not going anywhere. But I will not pretend the trust is complete when it is not." God is not deceived by partial trust. He receives it, he honors it, he works with it, but he does not mistake it for full surrender. And he cannot give to partial trust the closeness he reserves for full surrender. Not because he is withholding as punishment, because the closeness he has in mind is not compatible with a held-back heart. The way sunlight cannot fully illuminate a room with a shuttered window, not because the sun is unwilling, but because full illumination requires the shutter to open. The fear that keeps the shutter closed is usually, when honestly examined, a fear about love. Specifically, a fear that God's love is not as total as he claims. That if I give him this plan, this relationship, this version of my future, he will not give me something good in return. That surrender is a kind of gamble, and the odds are not clearly in my favor. Catherine's answer to this fear is not an argument. It is a testimony. She gave everything, not once in a dramatic moment, but in an ongoing way over the years, returning again and again to the things she had tried to reclaim, offering them again. And what she found, not as a doctrine but as a lived reality, is that God's hands are better than hers. That the things she feared losing, released into his keeping, either came back transformed or were replaced by something she could not have imagined wanting. The shutter opened, let in more light than she had any way of knowing was waiting. There is a particular moment in Catherine's spiritual biography, recorded by her confessor and friend Raymond of Capua in the Legenda Major, that illuminates the exact interior movement we are speaking about. It is not a dramatic moment. It is quiet, interior, easy to miss in its simplicity. But it is the moment from which everything that followed became possible. Catherine had been living in her small room for 3 years. She was praying, fasting, in silence, and she was experiencing during this period what she would later describe as a sustained interior battle between her will and God's. Not about sin, about ownership, about who had the final word over her life. She had given God her chastity, her obedience, her comfort, her time, but there was something, and she knew what it was, that she had not given. Her will, in its totality. The last remaining piece of herself that she was still managing rather than offering. The moment came not in a vision, not in a supernatural experience, but in the ordinary texture of prayer. She simply became aware, with a clarity that she described as a gift rather than an achievement, that she had been holding back. And she saw, in that awareness, what the holding had cost, a quality of union with God that had been available to her, and that she had not quite allowed herself to enter. And she said yes, not dramatically, not once and then finally at peace forever. She said yes in that moment, and then said it again the next day when the impulse to reclaim returned. And again the day after that. Yes as a practice. Yes as a returning. Yes as the ongoing act of a will that had decided, not once but continuously, to live open rather than closed. What followed in Catherine's life was not ease. She was not handed a life free of suffering or uncertainty. What followed was mission, vocation, the extraordinary expansion of a life that had been contracted around its own protection, and that now, released from that contraction, moved into the world with a force and a freedom that made her contemporaries feel they were watching something barely human in its scope. She walked into the cells of condemned men and stayed with them until death. She entered the plague districts of Siena and did not leave. She carried on correspondences with royalty and clergy and common people, simultaneously, each letter finding the specific register of the soul it was addressed to. She fasted to a degree that her spiritual directors worried over and her critics mocked. But what her critics saw as self-punishment, those who knew her from the inside understood as the act of a woman who had discovered that she was most herself when she was holding nothing back. The moment of yes does not look the same for every soul. For Catherine, It came after 3 years of solitude. For you, it may come in a Tuesday morning, in the ordinary middle of your life. It does not require special conditions. It does not require spiritual readiness or the resolution of every doubt or the absence of fear. It requires only the willingness to say, in whatever interior way you can manage, "This thing I have been keeping, I am giving it to you. Not because I know what will happen, because I have decided that you are more trustworthy than my fear." There is a particular teaching of Catherine's that comes directly from her mystical conversations with God, conversations that form the substance of her great work, the dialogue, in which she describes what God told her about the soul that is almost there, the soul that is close, that has given much, that prays faithfully, that loves genuinely. He said, "This soul is like a person standing in a doorway. They have 1 foot in the room where I am, and 1 foot in the room where they have kept their private reserve. And they stand in the threshold, wondering why they do not feel the warmth of the room they are trying to enter. The threshold is not the room. You cannot experience the warmth of a room you have not entered, and you cannot enter a room while 1 foot is still outside it. The soul that stands in the threshold of surrender, close, genuine, faithful, but not quite fully in, is the soul that experiences exactly the quality of spiritual temperature we have been describing. Not cold, not absent, just not quite the warmth of full presence, because full presence requires full entry, and full entry requires the foot that is still outside to step in. For some souls, this happens all at once, a moment of decisive interior movement that changes everything. For most souls, it happens slowly over years, the foot coming in by degrees as the fear is worked through and the trust is built. Both are valid, both are received. What matters is the direction, toward the room, not away from it. Catherine would say to you, "The foot you have outside, you know which one it is. You have always known. And the room is warm. I have been in it. It is more than you are currently imagining." Step in. The question that the soul at the threshold is always really asking, underneath the theology, underneath the fear, underneath the very reasonable concerns about what surrender might cost, is, will it be worth it? It is an honest question, a human question. And Catherine would answer it not with argument but with testimony, with the specific, embodied, irreducible fact of her own life. She went in. She stepped all the way in. And what she found was not the diminishment she had feared, but the fullness she had not dared imagine. She described the experience of full surrender to God using a particular word that recurs throughout her writings and throughout the dialogue. Pace. Peace. Not the peace of absence of difficulty. Her life after surrender was arguably harder in external terms, more demanding, more costly in physical and emotional ways. The peace of interior unity. The peace of a person who is no longer divided against herself, no longer spending energy managing the gap between what she has given and what she has kept. This is the peace that Paul writes about that passes understanding. It is not comprehensible from outside the room. It cannot be explained to someone still standing in the doorway. It can only be testified to. Catherine testified to it. The mystics of every generation testified to it. The ordinary souls, the ones you may know, the ones whose faith you have been quietly envying without quite being able to say why, They are often testifying to exactly this if you listen beneath the surface of what they say. They went all the way in, and it was worth it. But Catherine's testimony on the other side of surrender is not only about peace, it is also about freedom. She wrote that the soul which has surrendered entirely to God is the freest soul that can exist, more free than the soul that holds things back, because the held back thing is always, in some sense, a chain. What you refuse to give God, you are required to manage, to protect, to carry. And the carrying of it, the constant, low-level management of the thing you have decided cannot be released, is a form of bondage that is easy not to notice because it is so constant and so familiar. The moment it is given, the moment the management ends, and the thing is placed in hands larger and more capable than yours, there is a lightness that Catherine describes as almost physical. Something that was pressing without your awareness of the pressure suddenly lifted. A weight you did not know you were carrying, set down. She also writes about something else on the other side of surrender. Something that is rarely mentioned, but that seems to her almost the most important thing. The specific and unmistakable quality of God's presence that becomes available to a soul that is holding nothing back. She writes that he draws close to such a soul, in a way that is qualitatively different from his presence, in a soul that is still managing its held-back portion. Not that he is absent from that soul. He is never absent. But the closeness that becomes available when the whole heart is open is, in her description, the closeness she was made for. The closeness she had been feeling just out of reach for so long. This is what you have been reaching for. The distance you have felt, the muted warmth, the layer of glass. It is not a permanent condition. It is a threshold experience. The distance is the feeling of the doorway, and the doorway is real, and crossing it is possible. And on the other side, the distance ends. Catherine's last words, spoken in Rome in 1380, as she was dying at 33 years old, the same age as Christ at his death, were, "Father, into your hands I commend my soul." Not a dramatic theological statement, the oldest prayer in the Christian tradition. The prayer of a person who has spent a lifetime learning to give what is most precious into hands she has learned to trust completely. She had practiced this moment her whole life. Every time she returned to the sealed room and found it was no longer sealed. Every time she noticed the impulse to reclaim something she had already given and said, "No, he has it." Every time she stood in prayer with nothing held back, no portion reserved, the whole heart open. She has been practicing for this last surrender her whole life. And that practice, that long, quiet, repeated practice of opening rather than closing, is what she would offer you today. Not the demand for a single dramatic act of surrender that resolves everything forever. The invitation to begin, to find the specific thing that is currently keeping you in the doorway, and to open your hand around it, and to say, simply, without performance, without certainty about what comes next, "This is yours too. I am not keeping this anymore." You do not have to be Catherine to do this. You do not have to have 3 years of solitude or mystical visions or the courage to correct a pope. You need only the honesty to name what you have been holding back, and the willingness, even a frightened, uncertain willingness, to let it go. The room is warm. He is in it. and the distance you have been feeling is exactly as close as the door you have not yet opened, and exactly as close as the moment you choose to open it. Come in.